Greetings and welcome back to Fire Jump. This is the third part. My name's Aaron Craig with Let's Learn This Together, and today what we're going to be doing is creating the fire obstacles, the way to defeat them, and we're going to be adding in some sound effects as well to make the game a lot more fun to play when we're testing it and going through. So if you're not sure what we're doing, we are creating an awesome infinite platformer. Now this is the third part out of 4, so if you don't know what we're doing and you jumped into this video, make sure you go back and start at the beginning. Otherwise, you will have no idea what's going on and get lost very quickly. Other than that, let's go ahead and dive right in. So we're going to first bring in the fire sprite that we need. So we're going to go down to our sprites, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to create a new sprite here. I'm going to call this SPR underscore fire. I'm going to click on import, and then I'm going to go to art assets, animations, and we want the SPR fire strip 17. The 17 means that it is going to be an animated sprite made up of 17 frames, and I'll click open, and voila. Here's the fire. I think it looks really nice. It's already animated. We don't need to change the speed or anything of that. We just need to change the origin to bottom center. And then we also need to change the collision mask because we don't want the player to collide with parts of this sprite that aren't actually the fire. So we're going to change it from automatic to manual, and we're going to bring this down to just about where the fire actually is at. Now, depending on how difficult you want to make this game, you can increase this for a more difficult challenge, or you can decrease it to make it a little bit easier for the player. Your game, your choices. Next, we're going to create an object for our fire. So I'm going to open up the objects. I'm going to right click, create a new object called obj underscore fire. Big surprise, right? Then we're going to assign that fire sprite to this. And then we're going to go to parent, and we're going to select the move parent that we've been using for everything else, because this needs to go down off the screen just like all of the other objects that we've been using, like the civilians and the windows. So along with that, we also need to destroy this fire when it gets too low and it's off of the screen. So we're going to add an event, and this is going to be a step event. And now let's search for the if variable block, drag it inside of here. And what we're looking for is our Y position greater than the room height plus 200. So when this is below the room and it's outside by 200, to make sure that we don't see any of it here, because remember the origin's bottom center, so this is where it's actually looking at the Y, so we need it to be all the way up. And it has a height of 205, but you can see there's a bunch of blank transparent pixels at the top, so 200 will be plenty to make sure it's completely outside of the room, no longer visible to the player. So when we are at the room height plus 200, then we are going to destroy this. So I'm just going to search for destroy, drag it in here, and that's all we need on this object. It will get created, which we're going to do in just a second. We're going to spawn that fire on a windowsill. When it gets below the room, it gets destroyed, the window gets brought back to the top, and it continues forever and ever and ever, just the way we want. And now let's jump over to the window, because this is what's going to handle the actual spawning and creation of the fire. So obj window, and we're going to look in the step event, and we have a lot of code here, so I'm actually going to go ahead and full screen this and minimize the tab on the right here. And remember what we've got inside of here. We have one if statement that is creating a random number, and then we are moving the window based on that X and Y, that number that we got there, and then we're making another number, and that number is actually determining whether we create a civilian or not. So we have a minimum of 0, a maximum of 1, and we create a temporary variable called chance. And then we set the sprite, specifically the sub image for that sprite, back to 0, because if we have case 0, it sets it to 1, which is the civilian window, instead of just the closed window. So we check to see which number we have from this random number chance. That's what this whole switch statement does. So this is where we're going to want to add creating the fire. So if we add another case, I'll just search for case, and down here under switch, we can add another case by dragging it right here, and you'll see that now these are clearly connected, but all underneath this one switch statement. If I set this to 1, it will now spawn a fire when it's a 1. But we don't necessarily want it to just be 0 and 1 here. At least we don't want this number to only be 0 and 1, because that means that we're either going to have a civilian window or a fire window once we get this set up. And those two options don't leave a lot of room for everything else. There's not going to be any windows to jump on. So I guess maybe if you really wanted a challenging game, you could do this. But we're going to change it just a little bit to where this maximum number to 3, which means that we now have 0, 1, 2, and 3 that this number could be. So there's a 50% chance that we're going to have just a default window that we're not going to change, a 25% chance it'll be a civilian, and a 25% chance that it's going to be a fire window. So let's grab a create instance and drag it right down here underneath the case. And what we're going to create is going to be our obj_fire. And where we want to create that is xy00, but they both need to be relative to the window we're on, just like the civilian. Then we're going to change the layer to spawns, because that's where we are spawning things at. And lastly, we want to change the window, because if we go back and we look at SPR window, the first subimage is for the closed window, the second subimage is for the civilian, and the third is where we're going to put the fire that we just created. So I'll go back to the tab over here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to set that sprite. So I'm going to search for set. And we don't want set global variable. Instead, we want under instances, set sprite. And we're going to set this to SPR window, because what we're actually doing is just setting the frame to 2. And then it will change it to that fire. Now let's go ahead and run it, and we can check it out. The fire isn't going to hurt us yet, but we should start seeing some fire windows along with the civilian windows. And there they are. And I think it looks really nice. It's a nice animation, and you can see it's blended in here just the way we want. Perfect. And so what we're going to do next is actually set up so that when we touch that fire, we actually lose the game. So for that, we're going to need another sprite. It's going to be the last sprite that we have for our player. So I'm going to right click on the player group and create a new sprite. This one is going to be called SPR_player_defeated. I'm going to click on import. We'll go back just a tiny bit into art assets, character, whichever one you're using, and we're going to grab this sprite right here. Make sure that you've got middle center on the origin if you didn't already change the preferences like I showed you how, and that's all we're going to need for this. So how we're going to handle losing the game is by when we touch the fire, we're going to remove the player object so that we can no longer move around, and instead we're going to create a new object specifically for a defeated player. And inside of there, we're going to have it react just like how a civilian does when it gets rescued. It'll pop up, and then it will fall off the screen. And when that object is completely off the screen, we will restart the game to allow the player another attempt. So that means we're going to need another object here. So I'm going to right click, create object. We're going to call this obj_player_defeated. I'm going to drag that defeated sprite onto here and assign it to that. And then we're going to add a create event. And this is going to be very similar to what we did with the civilian. So we're going to search for set speed. And what we're doing is looking down here in movement, and we want this one right here. So we want to set the speed, and it's going to be a vertical speed of -15, not 155, -15. And then we're going to set the gravity force. So I'll say set gravity, and not global variable. Instead, we want set gravity force right there. And we're just going to put it to 1. And then that will take care of popping the player up, or the defeated player, and then pulling them back down below the screen. Then let's add a step event to check to see when we are outside of the room. So I'm going to add step event, and we're going to check that if variable, which is right here. So it's actually underneath common. We don't even need to search for it. So we're going to check y is greater than room height plus 50. And that will check to see when we're outside of the room, and that will be plenty enough for us to restart the game. And so now the only thing we need to figure out is how and where we're going to create this object for when we lose. And the place that makes the most sense is actually in the player object. So let's go ahead and open up OBJ player and add a new event. This is going to be a collision event with the fire. And now inside of this collision event, we're going to create the defeated player and then destroy ourselves. And we're going to do that exactly where we're at. So the first thing we do is we're going to create another instance. So I'm going to drag this inside of here. And what we're going to make is OBJ player defeated. And we're going to make it at 0, 0 relative to ourselves. So it's exactly where we are. We're going to put it on the player layer. And then search for destroy instance, drag it down here. Now it might look like we're destroying the instance we just created, but what it's actually doing is destroying ourselves. Unless we go in and we specify another instance to destroy instance always is just talking about ourselves. So let's run the game and check this out, because now we should have a pretty full gameplay loop here where we can rescue civilians, and when we touch the fire, boom, we die. Except we forgot one thing. We didn't actually reset the game. So let's go back, and inside of OBJ player defeated, we're going to want to restart the game. So just search for restart game, drag it right here, and that's everything we need to do to now, when this is outside of the room, the game is just going to completely restart. And so now let's go ahead and run our game and test it out. When we touch the fire, we should switch into a new state, essentially a death state, which is what we want, and there we go. Game restarts exactly the way it should. And so that's the core gameplay loop. The other way that we can lose, though, is when we actually miss a ledge and we fall off. Right now, nothing happens, except essentially we can no longer do anything because we're just falling indefinitely. So what we're going to do is add a way that we can actually lose when we are outside of the room. And since we already have this all set up, let's go ahead and right-click on OBJ Fire, and we're going to duplicate this event, but we're going to turn this event into an intersect boundary event. So essentially, if we move off too far to the left or the right, or we fall all the way down, we will now die. And so let's go ahead and run this and check it out. So if we go to the left, we'll die because we've touched the boundary. If we go down, we die. And if we go too far to the right, we die. Exactly how it should work. So duplicating events like this is really handy. So if you have one that you know works, like when we were doing the key down left and right, that would have been one that we could have pretty easily duplicated. Just showing you another way of being able to quickly and efficiently get your code up and running. GameMaker is great at getting your games working and running quickly. One of the really great benefits of working with GameMaker Studio. Now the next thing we're going to tackle is being able to shoot foam so that we can put out the fires. Because right now there's really no way of actually getting above those flames. So essentially when we encounter one of them, it's kind of game over. Unless you've really narrowed that down and made it kind of easy so you could jump on the edges of the fire ledges, which could itself be a pretty interesting mechanic. But we haven't done that. And so we need a way of putting out the fires that we are encountering right above us. So now let's go ahead and get that mechanic set up in our game. We're going to need a new sprite for that. And I'm going to right click on sprites, create a new one. This one is going to be called SPR_foam. I'm going to click on import, art assets, and this is going to be an animation. So this is going to be foam strip 20. I'm going to bring this in, and here's the animation for you. It's a little poof of foam that we shoot that's going to go right above us so we can put out fires. So we just need to make sure that the origin is in middle center, and that's everything we need for the sprite. Now we need an object for it so that we can create it. So I'm going to right click, create a new object called obj_foam, open it up. Let's drag that sprite inside of there. Set the parent because we want this to go down just like everything else. The difference is we want it to go down after it has already been shot up. So we're going to add a create event inside of here, and we're going to set the speed when it gets created. So not gravity force, it's under movement. Grab the set speed, vertical, and we're going to give it a value of -40. This way it shoots straight up when it gets created. And then if this ever goes outside of the room, we want to destroy it. But the thing is, it's a little different than everything else we've been doing. All of the other objects, we've been using a step event, checking the Y position of that object if it is outside of the room, specifically below the room. And that's because a lot of those objects are actually being spawned at the top of the level, outside of what we can see. And so if we use the event, which we're actually going to use right here under Other, outside room, if we used this event on the windows or the civilians or the fires or anything else like that, it would trigger even though it's above the room and it's coming down into it. So we can't use those there, which is why we've been using the step event. But for this foam, it's actually being made inside of the room. And so then anytime it goes outside of the room, we want it gone. So let's go ahead and add this event inside. And all we're going to do is just destroy it as soon as it's outside of the room. And next, we need to actually be able to do something with the foam. We've got the object made, it's ready to go, but we can't actually create it. So let's go into OBJ player, and we're going to add a new event. And this is going to be under key pressed. So it's just going to trigger one time each time you press this key. And we're going to use the space bar. So the space is for the space key, the big one on your keyboard, and it's just going to trigger every time we do this. So what we want to do is create our foam. So let's go to instance, and we want create instance right here, and it's obj underscore foam, and we're going to do a relative x0 and y0, and we're going to spawn it on the layer of spawns. And we're almost ready to test this out. But before we do, we actually need to set up the system that when the foam touches the fire, it puts out the fire and it destroys itself. So let's go into OBJ fire now, and we're going to add a collision event with the foam. So collision objects, OBJ foam right here. And now what we're going to do in this collision event is drag a destroy instance and another destroy instance. So we actually want to destroy the foam we're colliding with and ourselves because we're the fire. So I'm going to click on this little arrow, and I'm going to select other instead of self. And you can see it has kind of a purple border around it now, and it says it destroys other on other. So this indicates that we are destroying two instances, the fire and the foam. Let's go ahead and run our game, because now we have the mechanic to actually put the fires out that we encounter. So if we press space right here, we create this, and it goes up pretty fast, and it doesn't come back down because when it goes outside of the room at all, it dies. And now you can see we can put out these fires just like that. So what we're going to tackle next is creating a really cool particle system effect for whenever we put out the fire. But we're going to do this a little bit different. Instead of just using a sprite like we've been using for the fires, civilians, everything like that, we're actually going to use the built-in particle system that GameMaker Studio has. And the particle system in GameMaker is very powerful, very flexible, and it looks awesome. It can be used for so many different things. And I'm going to show you just how to use it one way here to create a beautiful particle effect. Now, we are going to have a sprite to help us with that. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on sprites, create a new one, and I'm going to call this one SPR Fire Particle. I'm going to click on import, and it's going to be the one called SPR Fire Particles Strip 17. Bring this in here, and this is what this looks like for now. All we need to do with it is bring the origin down to the bottom center, just like we have for everything else we've been using on the windows here. Now, we're going to create an object that's going to manage the creation and the setting of the effects for our particles. So I'm going to go to Objects, right-click, and create a new object, and this is going to be called obj underscore game. And I'm going to go into our room, and I'm going to create a new instances layer and rename it Effects. And I'm going to drag this object into here. This one's not going to have a sprite. It's not one that we're ever going to see. It's going to manage the effects and the particles that it creates, but the object itself, as you can see in here, it doesn't have a sprite. And when you don't have sprites, traditionally, you take that object and you put it in the top left corner. That way you know where they all are. Oftentimes you can have many objects in your game that don't have sprites, things that manage your saving system, things that manage your particles, your scores, all of that. Sometimes they are HUDs like this, like we have in our game. Sometimes they are objects in the background, and you just want to group them all together so you know where they're at. Now let's go ahead and open up OBJ game, because inside of here we're going to be working with the particle system. And there's a lot to it, so we're going to break it down just one step at a time. So there's a particle system which actually manages the particles, and then there are the particle types. There are a lot of different types, but what we want is one that looks like fire. So let's set up the particle system first, because we need the system before we go in and create the particle types. So I'm going to add a create event inside of here, and I'm just going to search for particle. And you can see that they are all right here. There's a bunch of particle code blocks here, but the one we want is the first one, create particle system. So we have the layer, which we just made, called effects. So make sure you type that in there. We don't want this to be persistent, which means that it would stick around and go through room to room. We only want it to be in this one room, and the target saves the particle system right here inside of a variable. And we're going to call this particle system, and we do not want it to be temporary. So this is going to make a particle system and save it inside of a variable called particle system. We're really clever at namings around here. Next up, we're going to have the particle type. So we already have all of these right here. So now we're looking for particle type. What this is actually going to do is create a blank particle, which is basically it's undefined, and we're going to define it later with a bunch of these other code blocks. But for now, we're going to save this in a variable called fire, and we do not want it to be temporary, but we do want to blend this together. Blending it's an additive blending, and you want to use it whenever your particle is one that gives off light. Fire is something that gives off light, so we want to have blending enabled. And so now that we have the system and the particle type, it's actually time to define what this particle is going to act and look like. So there's going to be a lot of options here. So I'm going to go ahead and full screen this, because we're actually going to use a lot of these. So the order here doesn't matter. The values are going to create something that I think looks like a pretty good fire effect, but I definitely encourage you to experiment and change these around, because the more you do that, the more you'll actually understand what each one controls, how they interact, and how to create different kinds of particles inside of GameMaker, because you can use them for, well, really any kind of particle system. So think of things like snow and rain and dust and fire. All of these can be used with particles, and as you play with them, you'll make them look better and more realistic for what you want. So change it around, because remember, this is your game. So the first one we want is going to be set particle sprite. So we're going to have to go through and look at all of these, because, well, there's a bunch here. And right over here is the set particle sprite. So I'm going to drag this inside of here. The type that we want for all of these is going to be the variable that we created. So if I type fire, you'll see that it says it's a variable because we created it right here. And so we're going to set the properties of this particle variable, this particle which is referenced by this variable fire. We're going to set all of those with what we're doing right now. So the type will always be fire. Then let's find set particle life, which is right over here past set particle alpha. I'll drag this in here. Again, the type is fire. The minimum life is going to be 10. The maximum life is going to be 15. So this is how many frames this is going to last for, and it will randomly choose between the minimum and the maximum range. Then we want particle speed, which is actually right after particle life. So I'll drag this inside of here. Type is fire. The minimum speed is going to be 2. The maximum speed will be 4. The increase will be negative 0.01, and wiggle is going to stay at 0. And so this is going to determine the speed of every particle that gets created, and we're going to decrease that speed over time because we want it to be dying because we just put out the fire. Then we want particle direction, which is right after particle speed. So I'll drag this in here. Particle direction, the type is fire. The minimum direction stays at 0. The maximum stays at 360. The increase is 1. And the wiggle stays at 0. So this controls the direction of the particle that gets created. We're going to have it be able to move anywhere. So 0 to 360 is an entire circle, so it can essentially go in every direction. And we're going to increase that value by 1 over time. That way it gives it some randomness and gives it more like a real life feel. Next up, we want the particle size, which is closer to the front here, right after destroy. So we're going to set the particle size. Type is fire. The minimum size is going to be 0.7. The maximum size will be 1.2. Increase is going to be 0.04. And wiggle will stay at 0. So this controls the size of the particle between those values and how much it's going to increase over its life, which is 10 to 15 frames, which we've already set. So if you add this increase too much, it can get really, really big. So make sure that this one doesn't get too large, but again, definitely experiment with these different properties that we're setting. The last one that we need here is the set particle alpha, which is pretty close to the middle right here. It's after color and before life. So we'll drag particle alpha, put it on fire. The start will be 1, the middle will be 0.8, and the end is going to be 0. Alpha is the transparency, so we want it to start fully visible at 1. In the middle, it's starting to go opaque, and then by the end, it's completely gone. So that's a lot of different settings. We've created the particle system, and then we have completely set how we want this particle called fire to look, run, and work while it is alive. And we've also set it for how long it's supposed to be alive. And now the last thing we need to do here is make sure that we actually clean up and destroy these particles after they're done. Because GameMaker is allocating memory when it creates something new while the game is running, such as these particles. And if we don't destroy them when they're not needed, we can create something called a memory leak, which is when we are pulling memory but not releasing it. And if you do this too much, your game will crash because you only have access to so much memory. And if you don't control it and maintain it properly, well, you get really bad crashes and errors in your game. So whenever you make a particle system and a particle, just remember to clean it up. And we can do that by going back to our particle, and there's an event called cleanup. So we're going to add that, and I'm going to drag this tab into this tab up here. So you can do that if you have some tabs outside in the workspace and some in this full screen. It can be a little confusing, but you can move them between to put them all together, which helps. And inside here, we're just going to search for destroy particle. So down here, we actually have a destroy particle system and a destroy, where is that at? Particle type. So we're going to drag the particle type first because we created it as the system and then the particle. So we want to destroy it as the particle and then the system. The one we're destroying is fire because remember, it's a variable and it's not temporary or local, so we can access it in this cleanup event. And then we want to destroy the particle system, which we can actually see it was called particle system. So I'll type out particle underscore system. And that actually destroys it and takes care of what we need. No memory leaks, everything is perfect. And so now that we've taken creating and destroying them, what we need to actually do is spawning them inside of our game. The way we're going to handle that is actually inside of obj fire. In the collision event with the foam, we need to use a special code block called burst particles. And we can put this right down here at the end. And we need to be able to access obj game though, because that's where the system and the type are located. And we can do this without using a global variable, because we can actually just say obj underscore game, and we can use a period, and then we can access the variables inside of that object. Now, if there were multiple game objects, we might not know which one we're accessing. It would be totally random. But because we only have one game object, because that's how we've set it up, we can do this without worry. So we want the particle underscore system, and you can see even the autocomplete starts showing it up right there. And the type is obj game dot fire, and that's the name of the type. And we're going to have it 0, 0 relative, and the count is going to be 4. Change it to whatever you want to experiment, but that's everything we need for that. So let's go ahead and give this a try, because we've spent a lot of time working on this particle, and now I'm excited to see it in action. So it'll happen when we collide with the foam and the fire. So there we go. And I think that looks really, really great. So that is the particle systems in action inside of GameMaker. They're very versatile, really handy, and anytime you need any kind of particles, just small graphical things that move around randomly, and you don't want to draw a sprite for that because you want it to be dynamic and ever-changing, particle system is what you want to think about. Now, the last thing for this part is to add in some sound effects, because we haven't had any noise inside of our game, and it's getting kind of boring. Sound effects add so much to a game. The music, the effects, everything, it brings it to life. Right now, we've got great looking art, but without any sounds, it feels dead. So let's go ahead and fix that. Let's learn how to work with sounds. It's really not that hard. It's a new kind of asset though, so we have a special group for it, sounds. I'm going to go ahead and right click, create a new sound, and the prefix for it is SND, and we're going to call this game music. We're going to have several different ones that we're bringing in here, but we'll start with some game music. So to do this, we can choose the sound file inside. Click on this. You'll need to jump back out of art assets and actually into the audio assets, and the one we want is called sound game music. So we'll open this up, and then we can preview it. This is the sound editor right here. So we've got the name, the volume, the playback controls, the position of the music, and then we have a bunch of attributes down here, which for the most part, unless you know you need something changed, go ahead and just leave it the way it is. So I'll go ahead and press play, and we can preview this. And I think it sounds really good. It's very fun. And we've already heard it before because we played the game in the first part, the finished product, which had this music in it. But now it's time to put it into our game. So let's go ahead and open up the obj game object, because that's actually going to handle playing the music as well. So this is going to be a very versatile object. So we're going to open up the create event. So what we're going to add in all the way down here is we're going to search for stop all, and what we want to do is stop all audio right here. And this is just going to stop any music that was playing. Now right now it doesn't make much sense because we don't have anything else playing, but once we get the main menu set up, then we'll have audio that carries over, and we don't want to have that. We want to kill everything else. So we want to stop all audio, and then we're going to look for play audio. Drag that down here. So the sound we want is sound game music. We only have that one, so it's pretty easy to find. We do want it to loop, which means when it ends, it'll go right back to the beginning forever and ever. And that's everything we need to do to just play audio in our game. And so now if we run this, we can actually listen to that audio, and we'll hear it inside of our game. Awesome. So now what we need to do is set up the rest of the sound effects for this part. So we're going to need 5 more sound effects. So I'm going to click on sounds, and then I'm going to click plus for creating assets, change this to 5, click sounds, and press create. So the ones we're going to want are the player jump, player defeat, player shoot, civilian rescue, and fire out. So we'll go ahead and grab those right now. So the first one up here at the top is the civilian rescue. So I'll go ahead and open this up, and we'll rename this to sound civilian rescue. And then we'll go to the next one here, which is the fire out. Rename it to sound fire out. And then sound 4 is going to be sound player defeat. Sound player defeat. Sound 5 is going to be sound player jump. Sound player jump. And lastly is sound player shoot. So this is the foam that we're shooting out. All right, we've got all of these right here, and my guess is you probably already have a good idea of where to put these because you already know how to play sound effects and music. But I'll go ahead and show you where I'm going to put them and see if we line up on that same page. So first one we're going to do is the player sound effects. Let's go ahead and open up OBJ Player, add in a play audio, and what we want to search for is sound underscore player shoot. So this is when we shoot the foam out. And we don't need to loop it, and we don't need to have any target here. And that's everything we need to do to play that audio. Now we can do the rest of them as well. So when we collide with the window, we can go to right down here and just play audio at the bottom, sound underscore player jump. And then we also have one for when we're defeated, but we don't want to put it inside of this object. We actually want to go to OBJ player defeated, and in the create event, because when it gets made, we've touched fire and we've lost. So we're going to search for play, and we're going to play the sound player defeat sound effect. But we also want to stop the game music for just a little bit until the game actually restarts. So then let's search for stop, and we don't want to stop all audio because it'll actually stop the audio that we just tried to play. We want to search for just stop audio, and we can pass in that sound game music specifically, and it will stop it. Next, we'll go to OBJ civilian, and when we collide with the player, anywhere inside of here, if we play that sound effect, it will work exactly like we need it to. So I'm going to look for this play audio, drag it in here, and we're going to search for sound civilian rescue. Now there's a lot of code happening here, but it all happens nearly simultaneously. GameMaker will go through and check each thing, but it's not actually going to play this audio earlier if it was up here. It all gets run on the same frame. So whether the audio is down here or up here, it's going to work exactly the same. Just make sure it is inside of the if statement and you'll be all set. And make sure it's not inside of one of these specific cases, because if it is, then you'll have a problem where it only plays the sound effect on civilian rescue 0, 1, or 2, which is not what you want. Then let's go to OBJ fire. And in the collision with the foam, let's go ahead and play an audio right down here. This is going to be sound fire out. So this is when it goes all the way out. And now let's test the game with all of the sound effects we've got in here, because it should sound and look great. Cool. Now let's find some fires to put out. There we go. Rescue a civilian. They're all coming along perfect. And we lose exactly what we're looking for. So that's how you play audio in GameMaker. Not too complex, but it does have the ability to loop or just play it one time, and you can start and stop specific sounds if you put their name inside of there. And so that's the end of part 3. Great job on getting this far. Don't forget to ask questions if you're stuck, and we will help you to the best of our ability. In the next part, we're going to tackle some really exciting things like how to change rooms, sequences, creating a menu both for the starting of the game and the end, and setting up a high score screen and some UI effects to make our menu a little more fun to look at and interact with. I hope you'll join me for the last part when we can finish up Fire Jump. Until then, keep making, keep learning, and I'll talk to you later.